Isn't quantum mechanics all about randomness? Quantum mechanics has nothing to do with randomness. This is another widespread misconception and misinterpretation. Sean Carroll wrote, "Quantum mechanics is where things get interesting." When a quantum state is happily evolving along according to the Schrödinger equation, everything is perfectly deterministic. Indeed, more so than classical mechanics because the space of states. Dosen, to allow for the kind of non-generic funny business that let non-deterministic classical solutions sneak in. But when we make an observation, we are unable to deterministically predict what its outcome will be. Straight away, any rational person should detect a fundamental hole in Carroll's argument. How can something be deterministic when unobserved, yet indeterministic under observation? That's a category error. How can an observation change objective deterministic reality? That's impossible. Remember what Descartes said, an effect cannot have more reality than its cause. Equally, it cannot belong to a different category of reality. A deterministic cause cannot give rise to an indeterministic effect because of an observation or indeed anything else. It's logically impossible. Determinism and indeterminism cannot coexist syntactically. You cannot have part of the universe obeying a deterministic syntax and some other part obeying indeterminism. Science tries to avoid these problems by bizarrely claiming that quantum reality is in fact essentially unreal, becoming real only when an observation is carried out. This is exactly the nonsense that empirical logic leads to, since empiricists believe in reality only at the point at which it is experienced. As the empiricist philosopher Bishop Berkeley said, to be is to be perceived, i.e., things exist only when an observer is experiencing them. Therefore, when they are not being experienced, they literally vanish from existence. So, how do they return to existence given that they can no longer be observed? Thus, empiricism is totally contrary to objective reality, whereby things exist regardless of observers and observations. Objects have inherent persistence regardless of observers. This is known as object constancy. Rationalism relies on objective reality, not on subjective observers and their subjective observations and experiences. Rationalism places no reliance whatsoever on human experiences. After all, objective existence was there long before any humans were. So how can human experiences have any bearing at all on the nature of reality? They are the first things you eliminate in any consideration of ultimate reality. You can transform every standard interpretation of quantum mechanics immediately and automatically by accepting that we live in a mathematical universe, based on complex numbers rather than a scientific universe based on real numbers. The probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics arises exclusively from the attempts of scientists to remove imaginary and complex numbers from the outputs of quantum systems. To put it another way, it is the application of the fallacious man-made ideology of empiricism and materialism to quantum systems, which are actually reflective of rationalism and idealism that leads to so-called quantum weirdness. Scientists warp and distort the quantum equations in order to match philosophical requirements rather than scientific or mathematical criteria. If scientists stuck to the quantum equations as they actually are, i.e., involving imaginary and complex numbers, there would be no quantum weirdness. The weirdness is a direct artifact of a bogus attempt to interpret quantum mechanics via a bogus philosophy. Get rid of the bogus philosophy and the weirdness vanishes. Humanity hasn't even begun to grasp what quantum mechanics is really all about and what it actually tells us about reality. And it never will while it systematically misinterprets it via the man-made ideology of empiricism and materialism. It is critical to understand that the quantum equations and quantum results themselves don't show that reality is random. It is only a specific misinterpretation of those equations and results that generates the supposed randomness. If hidden variables, i.e., non-empirical variables, are accepted in quantum mechanics, there is no randomness. Of course, no one ever has, or ever could, prove that any result is actually random. Indeed, how could nature produce a truly random result? That would be a violation of the principle of sufficient reason. How could nature calculate a random result? How could it generate a random result? What mechanism would it use? What algorithm? What process could it use to arrive at a random result? It could do so only if it were based on magic, on miracles, on doing things for no reason, on acting without causes. All of this is irrational gibberish of exactly the type that empiricists and materialists routinely come out with, in direct contradiction of rationalism and idealism. When reality is conceived in rationalist and idealist terms, quantum mechanics makes perfect sense. When reality is conceived in empiricist and materialist terms, quantum mechanics makes no sense at all and is totally weird. It is not the science that is at issue, it is the philosophy applied to the science. It is not the evidence that is at issue, it's the particular misinterpretation applied to the evidence. Evidence is, funnily enough, not self-evident, i.e., it doesn't explain itself. Evidence is only as good as the interpretation applied to it. And if your interpretation is systematically wrong, all of your evidence is worthless. Abrahamists read the Bible and then look at current events for evidence of the end times, which they find in abundance. Of course, the people who don't believe the Bible find no evidence at all. So much for evidence. Enough already of people banging on about evidence when they should be referring to interpretation of evidence. A radically different thing. There are up to 20 different ways of interpreting quantum mechanics, each with radically different ontological and epistemological implications. Don't you find this hilarious? If science is so great, why can't it prove which interpretation, if any, is correct? Why can't it falsify the others? It's because science has nothing to do with ontology and epistemology. It's a naive bunch of arbitrary, ad hoc heuristics held together solely by the power of rationalist mathematics. Remove mathematics and the whole thing collapses.